What's good, y'all? I'm the G with a PhD, and you're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so I can continue to provide you with some real good content. So, let me turn off my phone here before I get this going. So, I want to give a shout out to Angry Man. And I had a long conversation with Angry Man the other day, and I want to reiterate my sincerest apologies for having taken a concept that you coined and using it without giving you the proper credit. And I also want to thank you for being a good man, a real man, stepping up and having that conversation with me instead of discarding me or going in on me without allowing me to be able to speak my piece. That to me shows your sincerity and it's an illustration of your character. So thank you. And then also thank you, man, for having the real magnanimity, having the humility to send hundreds of subscribers over to my channel. Real big up to you for that, bro. And in reference to that, I just want to recite a verse from the Bible, Psalms 133. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, that went down to the skirts of his garments. As the dew of Hermon, and as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. You see, there will be times in this life that you are traversing through that you will have disagreements with men. But real men settle their differences without resorting to violence and acting like petty, ignorant, and despicable people. So I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to have had that discussion with him about any disagreements that we may have had and to have them settled. Big up, shout out, love to you, bro. I also want to shout out BGS, I'll Be More, and I want to thank you for having thrown support to me and to my channel and to the love and the sincerity and the humility that you showed to me. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Tia San Johnson for also supporting me and the kind of work that I'm trying to get started here on this Green Gorilla channel. And also I want to give a shout out to a sister, Kendra D, over there at the Crimson Cure. Big up to you. I really enjoy hearing your content and listening to your analysis. But having said all that, I want to kind of get into a subject today that is very important, I think. And I think it's something that's often overlooked. You see, right now, there have been a string of deaths that have been occurring in the public of black men by police officers, by white vigilantes, and these kind of incidents are often the kind of incidents that everybody, they all focus their attention on these incidents when they occur and when a black body is outlined in chalk. But when these black men are alive, they're often looked at as rapists, abusers, and pathological creatures, as Tommy Curry would call them, man-knots. So what I really want to talk about is how there are a group of scholars, activists, blog journalists who often equate racism with sexism. They draw an analogy between the two. And what I want to do is I want to disentangle racism from sexism and to illustrate that they are not the same at all. They're not the same in kind, and they're not the same in degree. In any event, what I want to do is make reference to an article that I recently ran across, written by a woman, a white woman, ironically, who also makes the same kind of points. This white woman's name is Ann Dummett. She is now deceased. She died in 2012, and she was an English activist and a campaigner for racial justice and a published author. And the name of the article that she wrote was called Racism and Sexism, a False Analogy. So what I want to do is I want to kind of go over certain segments of this article and then unpack them or decipher them in a way that anybody can understand them. And then after that, try to point out how they are relevant to our struggle, to Black men's struggle, and to Black people's struggle at large. So I can't read the entire article because it's quite lengthy, but I think that if I go into it and cover the most important parts of it, that you'll see the usefulness in this exercise. So again, let me just jump right in. So, and I'm quoting her here. She argues that racism, arguably the most important political phenomena of the 20th century, is a denial in theory and practice of the equal humanity, equal capacities, and equal rights of men, women, and children categorized by physical appearance or by national descent. Sexism, anti-sexists would say, is exactly analogous. The denial of these same kinds of equality on the grounds of physical difference. But this apparent similarity breaks down as soon as we begin to examine the results of racism and sexism. So initially, she already points out there are people who are going to try to connect racism with sexism. And intersectional theorists do just this. They argue that, okay, you got racism on one hand, you have sexism on the other hand, and people who are part of groups who are vulnerable to both racism and sexism are going to be impacted by a kind of double jeopardy. Now, she's writing at a time, and this article was published in 1975, 4 years after I was born. So intersectionality as a term hadn't been coined then, but already you had people who were willing to challenge the very idea that racism and sexism could be coupled together and equated as being something that is equally disastrous in terms of the results. So let me go back to the article again. And I'm going to follow up and repeat what I said before. So here I go, quote, "But this apparent similarity breaks down as soon as we begin to examine the results of racism and sexism. Millions of people in this century," and she's talking about the 21st century, not the 20th century, not the 21st. "Millions of people in this century have been killed because of their race. Jews systematically exterminated by gassing. American blacks lynched, shot, beaten to death, burnt. Many more have been enslaved, in practice, if not always in name, because of their race. Slavs by the Nazis worked to death in forced labor. Africans in South Africa serving prison sentences for breaching or for breaches of the law which were explicitly racial. We're talking about apartheid here. And working the land unpaid and unfree. Many more, again, have been reduced to utter poverty, degradation, and powerlessness because of their race. Many denied the right to be with their own wives or husbands or children because of their race. The victims of South African and Rhodesian land and labor laws. The victims of Britain's immigration laws. It is impossible to understand racism, to evaluate its workings realistically, to assess the true nature and importance of any of its manifestations, even apparently minor ones, unless we look at it against this hideous backcloth of cruelty and death. Racism denies the right of certain people to be alive. It does not always deny them life itself. So here you see a difference between being alive and merely living. You can be living but not be fully alive. And I think that's a very important point. So she says, racism denies the right of certain people to be alive. It does not always deny them life itself. Since it is often a matter of economic or political policy to keep them alive. But ultimately, it regards the lives of certain human beings racially categorized as disposable. It may be expedient to give a few of them good jobs in certain circumstances as a tactical maneuver, but in other circumstances, it may be expedient to deport them, evict them, or leave them unpublicly to starve. Always in the background is the shadow of death. So what are the wages of racism? Death. That's very important for people to understand. And I think you can already see where this is going to go. Because although one could argue that sexism is not something that's good, but sexism is not something that in the background ushers in the shadow of death. Now that's just my analysis. So let me jump back into the article and show and demonstrate what she has to say after having said what she said about racism and the wages of it being death. She says, the doctrine of women's inferiority to men has no results comparable with these. Death. It is true that in many countries, women have fewer rights under the law than men. Concern for their difficulties was not the guide to shaping anti-sexist doctrine and policies. So let me stop here. So she's saying, yes, it is true. In many countries, women don't have the same rights as men. But she's saying that when women, particularly Western women, came up with their anti-sexist doctrines and policies, they didn't have in mind the women in these other countries who have it worse than them. No, they had in mind something a little bit different. So here's what she has to say about what the women in the West really had in mind when they ushered in the women's liberation movement. She says, their distress has been absorbed into the concerns of the women's movement at a later stage than the comparatively far less serious difficulties of well-to-do wives in the West who resent looking after babies, washing their husbands' shirts, and being regarded as featherheads. Anti-sexist magazines in this country devote more space to discussing abortion, lesbianism, and sexual self-stimulation than to injustice or to international political issues. And the fact is that sexism is not, in the same sense as racism, an international political issue. It does not swing foreign policy decisions. It does not guide investment or affect the course of wars, nor has it caused mass exterminations. We have not seen millions of women being put to death because they were women. Yes, women were shot at Sharpeville, but because they were black, not because they were female. Women in the 20th century have been killed, tortured, and imprisoned, but not because they were hated or despised as women, always for their race, their political opinions and activities, their religion, or some other cause for which men have suffered at the same time. Now, this is just a very important point to draw out here. So yeah, some women have it bad in other countries. But the women who came up with women's liberation had something different in mind other than dealing with the issues of these women in the poorer countries. What they had in mind was freedom from what most women in the world would consider to be trivial. Not wanting to be a mommy. I don't want to have to be a mother. Washing your husband's shirt. Or being looked at as a featherhead, which is the equivalent of being an airhead. Or characterized as, like, say, for example, a dumb blonde. Or something like that. And then she basically says, look, you really are talking about abortion and being able to fuck other women and being able to fuck yourself with a dildo. You're not really caring about what's going on with women who are really in the mud, who are really having to deal with extreme conditions of inequality. You're worried about some trivial shit. And you have to think about it. What are most women in the feminist movement complaining about today? They're criticizing mansplaining, which is men weighing in on things that they have disagreements with feminists about, and how they don't need to talk or tell women anything because women, I guess they know better. And this is related to the concept of standpoint epistemology, which I don't have time to get into right here. But I mean, women feel like they have an understanding that men don't have. They have a position that allows them to know things that men don't know. And so men need to be quiet and stop trying to explain to women what reality is like, because women have their own reality. And the things that affect or impact them can't be discussed or talked about or pushed back against because men just don't have a right to do it. But the funny and ironic thing about that is women sure do push back and have a lot of shit to say about men. So they criticize men for mansplaining. But you know, men desperately need to be heard, especially black men. They complain about manspreading. But men have testicles and they need room when they're sitting in a chair or when they're riding on a bus. They can't sit with their legs crossed, or some can. I mean, that's all on you if you want to have your nutsack squozen. But most men don't want to sit like that. They're complaining about the climate control in buildings. But the reality is you benefit from living in a world where there is air conditioning damn near in every building, and when there's heating in every building. There's some people in other cultures who don't even have that shit. Women are worried about, or feminists are worried about, the pay gap. But let's face it, white women are already the second most wealthy demographic in the country. And also, let's face it, black women are far easier to employ or to become employed their black male counterparts. So while they're complaining about there being no women presidents or vice presidents, there being hardly enough women CEOs, while they're arguing about the visibility of gay people on television, when gay people can pretty much marry and fuck who they want with no inhibitions. They're arguing about trans death, when the number of trans communities and the deaths that they suffer from are infinitesimal in relation to black men. They arguing about the ability to cross-dress or to change their sex. These are just not problems that people who are not privileged have. I mean, think about it. If you're suffering and struggling trying to provide subsistence for yourself, you don't have time to be worried about whether or not you can change your fucking sex. These are all excesses brought about and trivialities brought about through being a member of a society that has abundance. They're trivial about domestic violence, when we already know that women are just as likely, if not more likely, to commit acts of violence against their male partners. They're worried about rape, when we already know that men are often raped and boys are often raped, but as a logical possibility, the sexual abuse and rape of men and boys is often ignored or perceived as a logical impossibility. They're worried about body positivity and fat shaming. But you live in a culture that allows you to stuff your fucking face with food saturated in trans fats. Now, I'm saying all this to say that the women's liberation movement is fixated on trivialities. They're not concerned about death. And we're not talking about the death of a few thousand people in a given year. We're talking about the death, historically, of millions of people just because they're a member of a race. So, I want to go back to the article. I want to go back to this article. She says, this vital difference between sexism and racism is not one of degree. It is, but she says, the vital difference between racism and sexism is not one of degree, but of kind. So she does talk about the impact and the results of racism and sexism, and says that racism has consequences that are far more dire and drastic than that of sexism. But she also says that when you try to compare sexism and racism together, it's not just the degree that's important, but she's saying there's a different kind of thing that goes on in relation to the phenomena of racism and sexism. So what racism does is postulates an essential functional difference between one racial group and another, associating with skin color or national descent the possession of certain qualities and lack of others. For example, they are less intelligent or more cunning. They are more violent by nature or more cowardly. They are better adapted to hard physical work, less apt for the arts, more feeble, more avaricious, less technically adept because of their race. Thus, Their function in society must be marked off separately. Their history must be distorted to fit these assumptions. Male prejudice and discrimination against women postulates similarly false theories. Women are less intelligent or more emotional, and so on. But with the crucial difference that there is a functional differences, or there are, or is a functional difference between the sexes, and a fundamentally important one, whereas there is no analogous functional difference between racial groups, however defined. Now let me unpack that for a second. And I kind of, stammered in certain passages of this quote. So what racism does is says there's a functional difference between one racial group and another, but that's all lies. Because there are no differences between racial groups other than phenotypical differences, one could argue. So to say that one group of people, like black people, they're more rhythmic, they have more soul, and white people have less rhythm and soul, or that like black people are dumber, or that white people are more intelligent, or that Asians are more intelligent and have higher intelligence quotients, in virtue of the qualities and features of their race. One could argue that's just a lie. There are no functional differences between one racial group and another. However, people make the same kind of claims about women, right? Namely that women are less rational or that they're more emotional, just in virtue of the fact that they're women. But the difference, though, is that when it comes to race, the argument she's making is that there is no essential functional difference between races. But when it comes to men and women, there is a functional physical difference between them. Now, what, pray tell, might this functional difference be? Well, I think it should come as no strange fucking surprise that women bear and feed children. Men do not. And she says this: women, and I'm quoting from her, women bear and feed children, men do not. Period. Now, the funny thing about this is that in the kind of culture we live in, increasingly, you're beginning to see women in the women's liberation movement trying to argue that men and women are, for the most part, essentially the same. That there's no real difference between men and women. Well, men have phalluses. Women have vaginas. Men have testicles. Women have uteri. I don't see how anybody's missing this. Like, how is it possible to argue the converse of this? There is a functional difference between men and women that has no analogy that can be associated with race. Now, this fact has nothing to do, and I'm quoting her, this fact has nothing to do with women's intelligence or aptitudes, but it has a great deal to do with their relationships towards the youngest human beings. In most parts of the world, as in all parts of the world in the past, a baby needs a mother to feed for many months, or at least a nurse, someone who's lactating. And they need them for years in order to survive. More obviously still, it needs a mother's nourishment before birth and effort at birth to be born at all. These are functions that no man can perform. No man can perform. But anti-sexists would like to have a world where this functional difference was as illusory as the supposed functional differences between races that racists pretend exist. That is why abortion and deviant sexual behavior are so important to anti-sexists. Damn. I mean, just damn. There you have it right there. Like, she's pointing out the truth. And you can say, okay, well, she's a white woman, so like, why would we listen to what she has to say? Well, I'm going to say this. Initially, early on in the women's liberation movement, the second wave of feminism and eventually the third wave of feminism. So the second wave I would consider to be like Betty Friedan. She wrote a book called The Feminist Mystique. And in The Feminist Mystique, she basically made the case that women who are housewives or in a similar condition to Jews in Nazi concentration camps. And I think she used the term, she said something like, women's condition is like that of a person living in a comfortable concentration camp. And here you see the triviality of the women's movement, especially or particularly second wave feminism, being played out and being compared to that of a fucking literal Holocaust. So you mean to tell me that in your mind, you would make or draw an analogy to the fucking massacre and genocide of millions of people with your desire to get out of the house and go work a fucking job when all of your fucking bills are paid for and everything that you desire and want? Because she was a fucking wealthy Jewish lady. So you mean you're going to draw upon the genocide of your ancestors and compare your condition to that because you want to get out the house and go fuck somebody or go lick another woman's vagina? This is the kind of shit we're dealing with here. And it needs to be pushed back against because it's a matter of great significance, because the women's liberation movement, one could argue, is the most successful movement in these Western cultures. It has far superseded that of the anti-racist movements, the civil rights movements, the Black Power movements. That's why you see it constantly pushed and pumped in popular culture. But see, the point is that these movements, this anti-sexist movement, it has to draw a parallel to race. It has to show that just like there are no real functional differences between races, there really actually are no functional differences between sexes. But we all know that that's not the case. This is why you see queer politics being played out so much in feminist politics. This is the reason why. And it's important for you to understand this because they have to be able to illustrate that there is no significant real difference between men and women. But we all know that's just a cotton picking lie. Women bear and feed children. Men cannot bear. They can feed them with formula, but they can't feed them with their breasts. So let me go back to the article. Western technology and social organization have taken away some of the functions of a mother with artificial feeding, like formula. They have attempted to take away more by experimenting with rearing embryos outside the womb. They have given women the power to avoid conception or to have some choice over when it takes place by the use of oral contraceptives. In most of the world, outside the rich countries, these innovations have had little effect. So, in other words, most people, and then again, this article was published in 1975. I'm pretty sure that oral contraceptives and baby formula has reached most parts of the world by now. But even if they are there, one could argue most women are going to choose to do the natural thing, especially in developing countries, because they can't even afford the fucking formula. And do you know, at one point in time, that there was a resurgence of breastfeeding in America, and one of the primary producers of formula was a company that is very popular in today's culture, Nestle. They create chocolate chips. They have cookie dough batter that you can buy. They have candy bars. I mean, Nestle is a humongous company. So the sales of baby formula had begun to taper off. And so what they did was they looked to other markets to be able to sell the formula. And guess what one of the markets was? Africa. And there's a funny thing, though, about their installation of the practice of bottle feeding babies that occurred in Africa. It's a funny thing that happened because when you stop breastfeeding, your ability to lactate disappears. Until that is, of course, if you have another child. So they took away a free source of nourishment for mothers to feed their children, and the women had begun to use these formula recipes or these concoctions, and they stopped being able to breastfeed, and then they had to continue to buy the breastfeeding powder or the formula from Nestle, but they couldn't afford it, so they started cutting it with more water than was suggested on the labeling. And so children had begun to become malnourished, and some of them died. All because of some excesses put forward by Western white women who wanted to free themselves from what one could argue is the most important or significant aspect of being a woman, is having the potential, the capacity to give birth to children and to nourish them and to nurture them in the earliest and most formative years of their lives. And for what? So that they could be absolved of the responsibility. Now, let me just say this. I don't think that every woman should be forced to have children. If she doesn't want to have children, she doesn't have to have children. That's cool. But at the same time, what has begun to happen is there are many women in the women's liberation movement who deride, stigmatize, who look down upon women who want to take on the traditional role of being a mother or a stay-at-home mom. Because one can argue, and I just want to say this, men going out to work is something that men feel that they have to do, especially like during the early part or the mid part of the 20th century. I'm talking about the 1950s and 60s, where men, for the most part, went to work, women stayed home. Like, do you think a motherfucker would want to go out to work if he didn't have to go out to work? Now, I'm not saying men don't like to work, because you can find very important meaning and substance in your life by dedicating yourself to a project. No question about it. And but the assumption, though, that being a mother is not an important job? That's the most important job that probably anyone could have in the history of mankind or womankind or humankind, however you want to categorize it. That's one of the most important functions. That function puts us as a species back into our natural state. And I think that what's occurred is women have begun to, because of the material success in this culture, they have begun to envy men. For what reason? I have no fucking idea. Because just imagine if you were, as a man, a group of persons who could just sit around the crib. And I'm not saying that taking care of children is an easy thing to do, but God damn it, I've done it. Yeah, children can run your ass ragged. But as a good parent, you don't need to be involved in every little fucking detail in what your child is doing. Sometimes they need to play on their own so they can learn how to become autonomous. And yeah, kids can be messy and they can, create all kinds of mischief around the home. But God damn it, I've never had that much fucking problem with the kids I've monitored and taken care of in my day. Now, I got 2 girls, and they were never that big of a fucking problem. And then, also, I've been in relationships with women who've had boys. We goes out and we kicked it. And, look, I'm a single man at the current moment, but, the point that I'm making is, I've lived with children. I know how to clean up a house. That shit'll be done, goddamn me, in the first hour that I wake up. I'm going to take care of everything. It's done. Bed made up. If there's any debris on the floor, debris, swept, mopped, vacuumed, any nastiness anywhere, I'm on it. Then I'm done with that bullshit and I can go about being productive in other areas or arenas of my everyday life. And then, to even argue, I don't think that women in the 60s and 70s were relegated to the home such that they couldn't fucking leave the house. You can take your ass outside. You can go somewhere and do something productive. You're not relegated to just be in that fucking house. And the very idea that women were just stuck in the house and they didn't do anything other than just pander to men in the context of a domestic situation, that's just not historically truthful. But then I'm starting to get into my feelings right here about this. But so let me go back to the article. And I'm going to repeat some of what I just said so I can move further on in it. Okay? Western technology and social organization have taken away some of the functions of a mother with artificial feeding. They have attempted to take away more by experimenting with rearing embryos outside of the womb. They have given women the power to avoid conception or to have some choice over when it takes place by the use of oral contraceptives. In most of the world outside of the rich countries, these innovations have had little effect. Women in the richest countries have been greatly affected by the use of contraception and artificial feeding. Most women have not. Some women in rich countries have taken these changes to be on a line of development towards complete abolition of sexual function and are impatient to press on to the end of the line, a point at which men's and women's physiology are not essentially different from each other. Damn. Goddamn. Damn. So that's why you see the ascendancy of LGBTQ politics within the confines of the politics of feminism. Now you're able to understand the connection between the two. That's why you see feminists pushing, promoting, undergirding queer politics. Because the goal is to create functional differences between men and women, to eradicate them, to do away with them, to abolish them, such that there is no difference in gender anymore. That's what gender fluidity means. And that's what they're aspiring to. And that's why you see so many women performing like men and so many men performing like women and being endorsed by the feminist movement. Now, I'm not trying to make an indictment of anybody who's gay or trans or any other, however you choose to express yourself sexually, that's on you. I really don't give a fuck who you sucking or fucking. I just don't. I never have. So I'm not going to sit here and be oppressive and discriminatory to somebody who, you like meat in the seat, that's on you. That's what you like, go ahead and get with that. I'm not on that, but if that's what you're into, go ahead and get on that. You're not going to have any pushback from me. However, there's something different there. There's a promotion of gender fluidity. There's the promotion of trying to do away with roles associated with men and women. Now, I have a problem with that because what happens is, in trying to eliminate functional differences, real ontological differences between men and women, and to try to equate racism and trying to equate racism with sexism, what you end up doing is you ignoring, because you have ambitions to be able to do what men are doing, because you think it's better on the other side of the fence. Right? It's better to go out and work than to have to fucking take care of these kids, because it's like being in the concentration camp fucking with these goddamn kids. I'm so fucking sick of these kids. I hate having to fucking wash shirts. I hate the son of a bitch of a man. Really? Maybe it's a little bit penis envy there. Maybe this is like a macrocosmic expression of postpartum depression. I don't know. I really don't know. But it's something to be left up for the imagination. So anyway, I'm going to go back into the article, and then I'm going to wrap it up because I'm getting close to the hour mark here. And I've never done a video this long. And I know people usually, when they watch videos, they only tune in for approximately 12 minutes at the most anyway. So you might have to dissect this and break it down into pieces to make it digestible to yourself. But I think this is important. I think it's very important, so that you can push back against the very idea that racism and sexism are the same. And when people try to say, well, sexism is just as bad as racism. No, motherfucker, it's not. It is not. It's different because the impact is different. So let me go back into the article. Anti-sexism's idea of women's equality is quite different from what might be called the political or reforming idea of equality. It depends on not accepting a functional difference while demanding equal rights in education, employment, property, and so on, but on minimizing sexual difference itself, sexually as well as socially and politically. An important part of anti-sexism is an attempt to find a new theory of human sexuality. Sometimes the minimizing of difference involves rejection of motherhood. Sometimes sexual admiration centered on the self rather than on another person. Sometimes a sexual attraction towards other women rather than towards men. Sometimes a relationship with men in which women can play the part of aggressors. All these attempts represent a revolt against conventions of Western cultures. But unhappily, they do more than this. They deny universal qualities and happinesses which American conventions in particular have vulgarized. They vulgarize in their turn and counter one distorted theory of human sexuality with another. And this is why I think men are repulsed by feminism and anti-sexist or women's liberation activists. Because it's not just women seeking to attain equality of opportunity with men. Because in order to actually bring that to fruition, what you have to do is you have to attack the very functional nature of sexuality itself. And you have to reject motherhood itself. I mean, if you aspire to do what men do, then you have to reject the role traditionally associated with being a woman, and that's motherhood. And you have to reject traditionally being associated in a relationship between a man and a woman. You have to reject that because that very relationship is going to have an impact on your ability to do what men do in the world, right, of commerce, or in the world or the public world of politics. So I'm going to cut it off here, and I might come up and do some follow-up on this subject matter. But essentially, what Ann Dummett is arguing is that racism and sexism are not the same. There will be many people who are going to try to draw comparisons between the two and to try to connect them one to the other. But first of all, what we know is women are not a minority. They never have been, and they never will be. Women have the capacity to bear children, and men do not. But if you aspire to do what men do, then you're going to have to attack the very notions of womanhood that have existed perennially throughout time. You're going to have to attack that which is functionally different between men and women, and to try to tease out a notion of gender and sexuality that is going to be the converse of what has traditionally been accepted as the norm. Also, what you end up doing is minimizing the horrors associated with racism. So in your aspiration to be more like a man, because you think it's more fun, why should men have all the fun? When you equate that kind of desire and the trivialities associated with that, with millions of people being haphazardly subjected to violence, genocide, slavery, exploitation, then we have a big problem. And this is all coming, for the most part, because this movement was kicked off by white women. And unfortunately, you see a lot of black women piggybacking on the ideas being formed by these white women. And look, again, as I said, I think women should have the same opportunities as women. We know that this is a culture in which there's material abundance, even though black people really don't get to participate and share in it. I mean, you still have to look at the relative affluence of people who live in American culture with that of people who live in developing countries. I mean, if you're poor here, you can still go buy a pair of Air Jordans. Go get some hair weave. Go get your nails done. Go blow a couple of motherfucking bands at the bar. I think that's some ignorant shit, but I mean, even the most destitute, unless you're homeless and in abject poverty, the people, you can go buy a big screen television at Walmart, go get you a Fire Stick and watch your latest movie, or go buy a video game and play your latest game that just came out. So we're talking about relative affluence related to people who are really actually suffering in dire conditions of poverty. Because there's some people in the world who just recently gained access to clean water. There's some people who still don't have electricity. That's why Akon is trying to bring electricity all throughout the entirety of Africa. And I remember Jay-Z setting up wells in some African villages because these people still had to walk miles to go get water. So one can argue sometimes Americans are trivial as fuck. And one can argue that this liberation movement, in many respects, is trivial as fuck. And that's why they're so doubled down on it. But I'm becoming incoherent, and I'm starting to veer off the beaten path. I just want to give y'all a shout out and say thank you for visiting the channel. And peace out. Have a productive day. 1.